Okay, let's talk chickens and food scraps. What can chickens eat? What's safe for chickens to eat? What will and won't chickens actually eat? And how to just generally feed chickens food scraps without making a giant mess or potentially causing harm to your flock. So let's get into it. Now, I'm a pretty casual food scrap feeder. I just throw out pretty much anything that is generated in my kitchen out to my composting chicken run. And in those scraps, there are things that I know the chickens are not going to eat. Things like citrus peels, onion trimmings, things like that. They're not going to eat them. Chickens don't really like alliums. They're not going to eat citrus peel. Things that they can't eat, like stone fruit pips, like out of a plum or a peach, they're not going to eat that either. But because I have a composting chicken run where organic matter will decompose very quickly, I just throw everything out. The chickens eat what they want to eat and leave the rest. And it decomposes into the compost within really just a few days in most cases. So that is my strategy. Now that's not going to work for everyone. If you don't have a composting chicken run and you're throwing out things that chickens aren't going to eat, then you're going to build up food scraps that are just going to decompose in a potentially not very good way because you don't have an ecosystem that can break them down. So there are things to think about when you're going to feed food scraps to chickens, and a lot of it depends on your setup. Okay, so what can chickens eat from a food scraps perspective? Well, chickens are omnivores, so they can handle pretty much close to anything that people would eat. There are some things to be careful of, obviously, because chickens, just like people, are not going to be healthy and have a good diet if the food scraps are things like white bread from the store, packaged and processed foods, highly processed foods. These are going to have too much salt, too much sugar, potentially too much starch in general. They might be low in protein. And in terms of packaged and more artificial type foods, the colorings and flavorings in those have not been tested for safety in chickens. So I wouldn't feed any highly processed food scraps to chickens. The occasional slice of store-bought white bread is not going to cause them any harm. But if you're trying to feed like a loaf of bread a day to your flock, then that can quickly displace better nutritious food from their diet. So that's not a good idea. When I'm talking about food scraps, I'm talking about things like fruit scraps, vegetable scraps, the scrapings from your plates after you've finished your meal if you've just been eating regular sort of from scratch kind of cooking. So basically, real food is totally fine for chickens. An occasional slice of pizza or donut isn't going to kill them, but that should be an extremely minimal portion of what they're getting. You're not even talking like once a week. If you throw out a stale crust of donut once a month, that's not a problem. But the bulk of food scraps should be just real food. Chickens can eat meat scraps, they can eat dairy scraps, and they can eat food that has gone beyond the point that we would generally eat it in this modern world we live in. But they can't eat food that is completely spoiled. So if you found some things in your fridge and you're not really sure, it's probably not good for us to eat anymore, but it doesn't smell too bad, there's no mold growing on it, that's fine. The chickens can eat that. It's not going to harm them. But if you've dug the stuff out from the very back of your fridge, you don't even know what it is anymore, it smells bad, that is not okay to feed to your chickens. They can get sick from spoiled food. But they're a lot more robust in their digestive system than people are. So yes, you can feed them fruit that's gone past the point we would want to eat. You can feed them food that's gotten older than we would want to eat it, but not food that smells bad or is visibly moldy. Don't feed that to your chickens. Put it somewhere else. Put it in the garbage, put it in the compost bin where they can't get to it. Basically, if you have a disgust reaction, the smell is terrible, it looks awful, that's not okay for your chickens. But if you're just like, I'm really not sure, maybe this is good, maybe it's not, that's going to be fine to feed them. Go right ahead. Now, one thing I don't feed to my chickens is chocolate. And I mean, it's not a common thing that will come up, feeding chocolate to your chickens, but if there's something like chocolate cake, then that's not something I'll throw into the scrap bin for them. That's because chocolate is toxic to quite a few animals, and chickens are no exception. The compounds in chocolate can actually be really dangerous for them, so I just don't feed them chocolate. They're not going to eat raw cocoa powder if you throw that out, but if you put out chocolate cake that's filled up with all the things that make it delicious, sugar and fat and all those delicious things, they're going to eat that. So don't feed them things if you are concerned that it might not be okay for them. Now, avocados are an interesting one. You often hear that it's not okay for chickens and lots of animals to have avocados. The skins and the stone in the middle are actually toxic for chickens, but the flesh is generally fine in not huge amounts. So I'm not too concerned about throwing out avocado skins in pits. First of all, they can't eat the pit and they don't eat the skin. So it just goes out as part of the general compost. The stuff I know they're not going to eat, but it's going to decompose. That's a personal choice, but I have been doing that for years. It's not a problem. None of my chickens have ever had any issues with what has been thrown out for them to eat or not eat as they feel like it. And you know what? Worms, composting worms, they absolutely love avocado skins. So I usually put them in my worm bin because they love it so much and chickens aren't gonna eat it anyway. There's stuff that chickens are going to struggle to eat. Raw, hard vegetables like big chunks of carrot, they'll eat it if it's grated or in very small pieces, but they're going to struggle to get through a raw carrot or raw potato. They're probably not going to eat raw potato peelings. They don't like citrus peelings. They're not going to eat the husks of corn. If you've got a composting run system, you can just throw it out and it'll decompose. If you don't, maybe that sort of stuff needs to go to the worm bin or the compost bin. So just keep in mind the things they will and won't eat. And it's possible if your chickens haven't been exposed to different types of food scraps, if you've got chickens out of a production system, like you've adopted battery hens after their first season of laying from a rescue situation, and they've never seen this as a food before, they might not eat it. Chickens are very cautious about the things that they consider to be food, and they essentially need to be taught that it is food. So if you have chickens that have just been eating chicken feed their whole lives, they might not recognize what you throw out for them as food, even if it's totally fine for them. And my chickens here might be like, yay, food, we're gonna eat it. So it may take some time for your chickens to get with the program and understand that this is food and to try out different things. Do keep that in mind. You might have to introduce the food scraps in smaller amounts so you don't end up with a decomposing food situation. When you're throwing out food scraps, you want the chickens to be able to eat the stuff that they can eat out of it within a few hours or a day at most. You do do not want to have slices of bread or fruit or vegetable scraps sitting out there starting to go moldy or disgusting. That's not good for your chickens, it's not good for their environment, and it could start attracting rodents. Now, I have had this question come up a few times about my composting chicken run system. People asking, does it attract rodents? And my answer to that is no more than having chickens does in the first place. Rodents can be attracted to chicken keeping systems because there could be some spilled food, there's sort of hidey places for rats to hang out. So yes, the occasional rat cruises around my chicken area, but nothing dramatic, nothing serious, nothing more than would be expected from the sort of semi-rural location of where I live. And the things that the chickens leave behind, things like onion skins, alliums in general, citrus peel, avocado skins, rats don't like to eat that either. So it's not attractive for the rats to come in, even if there's a few orange peelings left on the ground for a week or so. But if you are feeding your chickens more food scraps than they can consume in a short period of time, then that absolutely will attract rodents or other wildlife into your chicken keeping area. So you want to be careful about the scraps you're throwing out, the quantity, and what kind of system you have for managing it. Now, there are a lot of opinions about feeding food scraps to chickens and a lot of fear-mongering around it. I believe that in the United Kingdom, people aren't even allowed to feed their chickens kitchen scraps. Like, if food has gone into the kitchen, it is technically not allowed to be fed to chickens after that, which, I mean, that's entirely bonkers to me, but you know, you do you. And people say, oh, apple seeds are not okay for chickens to have. And like I've already mentioned that avocado pits are toxic to chickens, but they're way too big for chickens to eat anyway. And from an apple seed perspective, chickens would have to eat an awful lot of apple seeds to be close to having any issues. My chickens have near constant access to an apple orchard, and after the harvest, there are apples everywhere. They can eat as many whole apples as they want. And they have been able to do that while any chicken that has lived on this property has been able to do that for their whole lives. That has been the case for years and years. Chickens have been kept on this property by either me or my family members since I was a little girl, like for over 20 years. And not once has a chicken been poisoned by eating apples. So chickens, provided they're not starving, provided you're giving them a good base of a good chicken ration so that their base nutrient needs are being met, they're not going to eat things that are bad for them. And a lot of things are okay in small quantities, even helpful in small quantities, and bad in big quantities. Chickens are not going to eat things in quantities that are going to do them harm. So use common sense. Chickens aren't going to eat badly spoiled food in the first place, just like we aren't going to, by choice, eat disgusting spoiled food. The chickens aren't going to do that either. So long as they're not starving, so long as food scraps you're providing them are not their only food and they have no choice but to eat it. The only thing to watch is when it's packaged. Just like it's packaged for humans, if it's packaged in a way that's really appealing to them, and that's where my caution is about not feeding highly processed foods. Foods that are very nutritionally devoid, foods with fat, salt, and sugar. Chickens like that just as much as we do, so don't feed them lots of that stuff. Feed them real food. Feed them the things that you use to make your meals, your vegetables, your fruits. If you bake your own bread, then that's not a problem. I bake my own bread, and if I have crusts to throw out to the chickens, I have no issue with that. I know what's in it. I know it's totally healthy for them, just as healthy for me as for them. So if you're eating a generally healthy diet, it's going to be a generally healthy diet for your chickens as well. You don't need to worry so much about it. It's not that complicated. Chickens are pretty smart at making sure they eat what they need and not what they don't need.